All right. So what you have is a house that looks different because everybody else around it changed. There is a second type called a variance or a conditional use permit. A conditional use permit is one in which they want to change the property to something other than what it's being used for that could fit in that area. The best example might be like a daycare. Somebody has a residential house and they want to add a daycare, or they want to cut hair in the garage, or they want to change it to a house of worship. They could give them a conditional use permit. What you see here is a house that looks different because it changed. All right? That's the best way to understand the difference in these. The conditional use, or the non-conforming use, the house looks different because everybody else around them changed, they stayed the same, and now they look like the odd man out. It's not their fault. Everybody else changed around them. 1-800-CRYBABY. In the next one, which was, what do I call it? The conditional use, it looks different because it changed. It became a house of worship in a housing district, or it became a small business inside of a housing district. So it too looks different because it changed from everybody else. Best way to understand those.
So, like, if somebody opens up a daycare at their house, it's not like they have to advertise in front of their home that this is a daycare, do they?
Do they have to advertise? What do you mean? They would seek out a permit called a conditional use that I want to run a daycare out of my garage in this residentially zoned area.
But they don't have to tell their neighbors that's what they're doing.
Yes. Yes. We're getting ready to get into that. It's called remonstration. It's the only court case in the world where you have to invite people legally to yell at you. It is required that you send an invitation to them.
In Bartholomew County, you have to put a sign outside your house.
That's one of the requirements.
I don't know about other counties.
Yeah, it's with all of them. There are several things you have to do. Every property that touches you, you actually have to send them a certified letter with a court date telling them what you want them to do, and they get to come down, and at the zoning board of appeals meeting, they get to explain why they don't think you should have a daycare. Too many cars, there's going to be kids all over the place, yada, yada, yada. Then the board of appeals actually listens and makes a decision. It does not make a decision based on feelings. All right? There was a place called Southern Nights. Anybody heard of it? Nobody's going to admit to it? No, it was not a strip club. It was an adult bookstore. All right? So I hear. I don't know. It tried to build a building in a shopping strip center that was close to residential. They did everything they were supposed to do. They filled out, sent their forms, and we didn't finish up. Every property that touches you, you got to put on site, you got to put it in the newspaper, all this stuff. They get to come down, and all these people came down and told them why the Board of Appeals shouldn't give them the permit to do this. Guess what happened? They gave them the permit anyway. It's a legal, valid bookstore. There is a zoning for adult book. You guys may not agree with it, but technically it's still and they said, you have given us no reason other than you just don't want it.
Is that what happened to All-Star Sports Cabaret?
All-Star Sports, there was a little more money behind the remonstrators that came in. All-Star Sports Cabaret, so you hear, same thing happened. It was a adult entertainment establishment that got its permits denied. And there were some other reasons why, so I hear. You know, they didn't fill out the permit paperwork, and, you know, anytime they don't want something, they can find, hey, you didn't fill out, you gave us the wrong floor plan. That's not what the club looked like. So they lied on their application. But with Southern Nights, they did the whole thing. They went through, everybody complained, said, we just don't want it here because I just don't want it here. And they gave them the permit. Conditional use permit also only stays with the person. So you seek out a haircutting place in your house and you are given a conditional permit for a daycare, you sell the house, that conditional use permit goes away. That next person has to do it. Conditional use permit is also specific to an SIC code. So you can't get a conditional use permit to cut hair and then go, well, if I cut hair on a dog, I can open a groomer. No, dog grooming is a different SIC. You didn't ask for that. You asked for a barbershop. You have to go back and do it that way. So conditional use permit still has to fit. For instance, the toxic waste dump, that wouldn't be a conditional use permit at your house because that doesn't fit inside residential acceptable standards. All right? There's a second one called a variance. Variance does not really change anything that's there. It provides relief from a standard that is keeping you from building something. Okay? Most notably, the biggest one that could be is, for example, around the perimeter of your property, you have setback rules. You cannot build right on the property line. You might miss it, you might go over it, they might have to put a ditch, so they have these things called a setback. And I think in Marion County it's 10 feet all the way around and either 15 or 20 on the front of the lot. So you've got to build your house near the middle. But let's suppose you want to add on a garage that's going to go over that setback. You can apply for a setback variance. I don't want it to be 10 feet. Can I just move it to 8 feet so I can fit this new garage in? Once again, you go in front of the board and say, I want a variance of the standard. I don't want to eliminate it. I'm not changing anything. I just want to alter what's there so I can do what I want to do.
What did your acronym SIC stand for?
It's a standard industry code. Every company in the world has an SIC code. And that's how they base what fits in C2, C3, C4. So what you have are non-conforming use. You were there first. Everything changed around you. You then have a conditional use where you changed everything from around them. And then a variance is just a modification of one of the standards so that you can do it. For instance, you could have sought a variance in, would you say the roof or the windows or whatever the example I gave? You could seek a variance of that standard. Hey, I can't afford to put wood windows in. My first wife's mother and father lived in, I can never remember that, right there in Emerson and Washington. Irvington, thank you. And they were on the historic, and they went to put new windows in, and their windows were going to be like $16,000 for windows because they had to go with wood sill and wood frame to match the historic if they wanted to stay on the registry.
Shingles are a big deal too. It has to be the slate shingles.
Yeah. I know a girl that lives in that other place. No. Sonia. Same thing. They took the roof off because it was leaking, and when they went to put the roof back on, they came to them and said, now remember, we got aesthetic zoning. What?
The one on 10th Street?
Yeah. East, west, north. For me being in this business, I can never remember that.
I always forget the name of that.
Right there by the, yeah, it doesn't matter. point is, she had slate shingles. They came to her and said, remember, under our zoning laws, you have to look a certain way. You have to put back the shingles. Woodruff.
Yeah, they're
She,
very expensive.
she lived on East Drive in Woodruff Place.
We had over 200 extra shingles, and I still have them because I was not leaving them.
Yeah. So you showed them. You've been carrying them around just to show them through 3 houses.
I am going to sell them.
I've moved these 14 bungles shingles just to show them.
No, I have high school football players that do it. What if you have...
I think that was outlawed a number of years ago.
What if you have a deed restriction, like from a...
We haven't got to that. Your page is ahead of me. So hold on, we'll get to deed restrictions. All right, now, there's some other permits and standards that you have to think about. Most notably, what happens if this is my land, I want to build a 14-story balsa wood building? That's pretty cool, I can do that, right? No, for the health and safety of the people that might visit that building, we have these things called building codes. The building code says you must do X and Y and Z so that it is safe for the public. Building codes are nothing more than a set of engineering standards. Does not talk anything about how pretty it is or how aesthetic. You could have a building that passes building code and still be ugly as hell. All right? You know, things like got to have a 2-hour fire door. Anything more than 5,000 square feet has to have an automatic sprinkler system. Every time you put a plug-in near water, it has to be a grounded plug-in. Those are just codes for safety. Once again, taking away some of your control. All right? My cousin is a building inspector. When you submit plans to the state, he's the one that goes through them and says, this won't work. You know, can't be wood frame in a commercial building, got to be steel framed. Sorry, these plans are denied. Your permits are not issued for that. There is a very special set of permits for residential. It's called a certificate of occupancy. Or if you want to get slang, it's the C of O. All right? That's what they call it, the C of O. The certificate of occupancy is only used one place. That is between the builder and the very first home buyer. When the builder builds property, before he can sell it to the first person, he has to have a building inspector come out and look at his house and say, the window's locked correctly, the door's locked, there's sufficient air, plenty for the gas fumes, which we'll get to in the next chapter. I will pass this house, and you've probably seen them taped on the front window of a new build house. It says it has passed the inspection. So it goes from the builder to the very first home buyer that says this house is safe for human occupancy. From the first owner on down, what do we use? If you remember, one of the exemptions for the seller's disclosure form was new build homes. This is where we pick it up. When you go from the first buyer to the second buyer, they use that seller's disclosure form. This is defective, this works great, I don't know, all that stuff. That's from the first buyer on down, because the very first buyer gets a certificate of occupancy from the builder. Also, when builders do that, don't forget they also have federal regulations. So like the ADA, if they're building a building, it's got to have access to people with disabilities, so they can't build a 14-story building with no elevator anymore. Now it's got to have an elevator for access. Got to have the grab bars on the door. Door's got to be 36 inches wide so wheelchairs can fit through them. So there's also federal regulations that have to be involved with building codes.